Yeah, I've been working in the forests of northeast New South Wales for around 40 years. So in that time I've had the great good fortune to spend a lot of that time in the field and over the last few decades doing more and more research work. And the northern region, as part of the broader area of forests in Australia, is a particularly diverse one, and it's one that's, you know, oftentimes as described as rich as far north Queensland and other areas. But what's really important about all of this, of course, is that Australia as a whole has incredible forests, and over the last few decades to spend most of that time doing research work on the origins, the evolution and the ecology of our local forests, our forests right across Australia, and nowadays right across the world. And what strikes you about these forests and their values, of course, is not just their evolutionary history and their current day beauty and ecology, but their deep time histories. The fact that the forests that we talk about, whether we're talking about logging and timber industries or whether we're talking about national parks, all of those areas have that deep time history. We're talking here about 100 or more million years of deep time history. This is a history of evolution that's almost unparalleled, and continuity of occupation. So when we talk about things like we need to harvest wood or we need to use timber products, what we're really talking about is we're willing to disturb and destroy continuous history at that scale. More recently, we've been looking at the history of contact between Southeast Asia and Australia. And so the Southeast Asian vegetation and the history of that vegetation is of course, has also left a mark in Australia. So not only do we have this ancient 100 million years of vegetative history and animal history that has moved into Australia and then rafted north with Australia through 30 million years or more across the climatic boundaries that have transformed the continent from wet to dry, from rainforest to arid. But we also, on reaching the northern limits of that journey so far, made contact some 20 to 30 million years ago with Southeast Asia. And from Asia poured into Australia this whole lowland component of the tropical nature of Southeast Asia. And of course in Papua, which really are Australia's northern highlands, we see the penultimate interaction of the ancient Gondwanan and Southeast Asian floras and faunas. And so we live as part of that history. That on this continent there is that depth of memory of the deep time wet rainforests of Antarctica all the way through to the most recent and continuing interactions with Southeast Asia. So embedded in that is the history of our forests. And not only our rainforests, but our eucalypt forests, which are often the target of the aspirations of the timber industry, and in some cases a dismissive attitude to the idea that eucalyptus is everywhere. There's lots of them, so therefore it's just a resource. But Australia was never a plantation. It didn't start that way, and it shouldn't end that way. The reality is that the origins of eucalyptus, the oldest fossils, are from Patagonia. So those oldest fossils at the moment are around 52 million years. So that means that eucalyptus grew in Patagonia through Antarctica and maybe rafted with Australia or maybe rafted on a fragment of Australia and collided with Papua. But one way or another, as Australia dried and the rainforest contracted, eucalyptus became more dominant. So really only over the last, say, 20 to 30 million years as we dried out, did eucalyptus and acacia begin to spread across the continent. So what we're looking at now, of course, is not just a uniquely Australian genus or several genera that now make up eucalyptus, the corymbias and the eucalyptus and a few others. But the reality is that those as well have a Gondwanan origin, and they're no less important than the magnificent rainforests that we have as fragments now of what was there originally. And when we look at the history of the fauna in Australia and we understand the intimate relationship of these massive eucalyptus species with these beautifully developed hollows, the termite or rock-derived hollows, we begin to understand why we have so many parrots, why we have our gliding possums, why we have the distribution of animals that eat eucalyptus, like our koalas and some of our possums, how and why we end up with such a unique fauna that is wholly dependent on the outputs of that flora. And that flora, again, has that deep time history along with the animals. So we see the emergence of the diversity that we supposedly care about in this country being diminished. We see it constantly being derided as just another resource. And in fact, timber industries and the allocation of resources over time has seen the eucalyptus forests and the rainforests vastly diminished. And now to a point where things like hollows, which many species are dependent on for their nesting and their habitats, at a low point.
Lowest it's ever been?
Lowest it's ever been. There are fewer hollows now. In fact, hollows and hollow-dependent animals are more threatened than almost any others, except for the critical weight range mammals, of course, that are on the ground because we have cats and foxes and other predators. So that combination of factors, that we've cleared massive areas of country, that we've modified the remaining forests to remove key habitat components, and now we're at a point where hollow-dependent animals, some of our most iconic things like yellow-bellied gliders, our owls like masked owls and sooty owls, many species that are hollow-dependent are now reduced significantly in terms of their capacity to breed and to occupy country by virtue of the lack of hollows. So these, among many resources, are being diminished profoundly, and this is having a really big impact on our animals. The reality for us in the north and elsewhere in Australia, of course, is that those processes have basically shown themselves to be corrupted. That not only did we get a bad deal 20 years ago, and we're done over, and the consequence of that, of course, was that the remaining forests were badly and have fared very badly and been cut over heavily. We're now in a situation where those same agreements will be rolled over for yet another 20 years, but with this time with more watered down conditions. So because the few constraints on forestry that were in place, the protection of water catchments and creeks and streams, the area next to those, the so-called buffers, are now to be significantly reduced. And the reason for that is not because forestry does a good job and there's no erosion. It's because the last big trees, the only large trees left in the state, are in those buffers, and they want access to that resource. And there's no other reason. So basically we're trading off what little tiny bit of protections that we had. For threatened species, the Threatened Species Act has been turned over, so we've now got the Biodiversity Conservation Act. It doesn't apply to forestry operations, so we find ourselves with these new interim forest operations agreements rolled over again. They were catastrophic in the first 20 years. Now we're going to roll them over for another 20 years, but with less protections. So the outcome of that will be carnage on our native forests.